You said that there was this sort of cosmological void, and you contrasted the cyclical with this rupture, or time which was characterized by rupture. And I just wondered if there were instances where the second future carried on in some way.
Oh, absolutely. And this is the problem with sort of attempting to talk about so much in a short period of time. No, absolutely, and it's still very much, and sort of as these futures kind of cohabit in one space, one body, and so on, they really start to intertwine to the point where they become part of the same narrative. So it's no longer kind of clear cut in that sense. Certainly not in terms of socialism as opposed to some kind of traditional calendar. So they intertwine, and so the narratives of how people in the thermal power plant would take a day off, Christians and Muslims, and then kind of to celebrate St. Elijah's Day. So the kind of literally and in various other ways they intertwine.
Okay.
So it very much continues.
Yeah.
This kind of the 1990s are a more recent rupture. So in that sense, they still haven't produced the kind of the same amount of kind of merger and syncretism.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
I also have a tiny question for you, actually. I really loved what you've said about these time ruptures happening when people are waiting for the field to reassemble again. And you're connecting like the spatiality of it to the temporal notion. I'm wondering, is this only a temporal notion or the notion that we actually can give to event of celebrating, of meeting together? I mean, of course, you can't really put it separately, but is this an event-based thing or a temporally based thing? Because in my feeling is that, we said another beautiful thing, like the moment one feast ends, they start preparing for another feast. So the temporality of it is really, seen in a long term.
It stretches.
An event happens on 6th of May, on 2nd of August, on the day when the power plant is built or opened or whatever.
No, it absolutely, I think, stretches to include various things, and it's adaptive. It can include various things, like it included this other kind of waiting after the war. It really kind of the substance of that can shift. So it seems to already have the kind of this traditional waiting, if one could call it traditional. It seems to have that possibility to shift and change to certain circumstances. That's a good question. But then, obviously there's kind of the structure, the temporal structure that one can talk about, but so much of it is about, I don't know how one would term it, to kind of about the affective content of it, the affectivity of time. And I think there's still more there to explore, because one can chart out the calendar and these narratives, but the kind of the constant being in time, as opposed to thinking of time, but being in time is, I think, something. It's kind of a phenomenological thing that one cannot necessarily research after such ruptures that are so devastating. But enough about me. I also have questions, but maybe everybody else does.
I have a question for you, Mike.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed your paper.
Thank you.
And you gave this beautiful account of national time, right, and how people imagine Serbia as moving through time. And very simply, I was wondering whether not Serbia and beyond Serbia ever sort of featured in people's imaginations of the future. So, for example, approaching the European Union or not, or the potential intervention of the great powers. I know that in my own field site, people would call on the great powers and say, well, we can't decide anything, it would all be decided for us. So I was just really curious to know whether not Serbia ever featured in
Oh, definitely. Thank you ever so much for this question. I mean, I think that I wrote a lot about this imagination of the other from the Serbian perspective in very many different pieces, where people are constantly trying to understand, similarly to what Rebecca was saying, whether democracy, as it were, is good for them, is a working, definition that they can really kind of look forward to, whether the European Union is something that they should be looking forward. Like nowadays, they're saying they're absolutely against it. Like 2 years ago, it was a completely different scene. Today, I really wanted to focus on something I recognized as not purely Serbian, because they're making this reference even to American phrases and, you know, how the other is seeing you and how do you feel about the other, but about something that I think is really located within Serbian traditional way of thinking of time. Now, I can't even say that because there is not things that like that, you know, because these people are not. Even, for example, is very much anti any kind of religious sort of understanding of time, and yet in his musings he can be very mystical about many things. And when we talk about things, we can go into, you know, huge discussions about Nikola Berdyaev, like, you know, Russian mysticism and things like that. So of course there are millions of different kind of references constantly made, but interestingly so, this time they are more turning their gaze to their own sort of field, and that was actually very fascinating for me, because the usual thing is, like, you know, you're always in constant conversation with someone else who sees you wrongly or rightly, usually wrongly, as it were. So yeah. I think you've similarly kind of had this.
I mean, I was really interested in your paper that there was like this language. I mean, I was quite surprised about this language that your informants were using of like healing, harmony, carefully, gently, lovingly, like as contrast to their current experiences. And I just wondered like where that came from, that kind of language, because I would never hear that kind of language in my field site as a way of sort of compensating for the rapidity, the rapid and senses of precarity.
Well, they can be very livid about political and economic circumstances of Serbia, Europe and world. But I think that is the point, you know, they're also trying to change the language within which notions of politics are being cast and understood.
Yeah.
So even the language as such, the words, the way how you approach describing something is not like this is wrong and this is right.
Yeah.
And this should happen and this should not happen. But it's like we really have to understand, as it were, where are we standing?
Yeah.
And from that perspective, it's not where are we standing
To
vis-a-vis, the others, but also where are we standing vis-a-vis ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's a rather
different
move.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It's really
Which,
interesting.
when I found it was replicating, you know, I was like really, you know, I was wow, like what is this all about? Because it's not only about, you know, technological innovation. It's not about bright future. It's about let me understand myself through a sharper mode of scrutiny.
Yeah.
So
And also, I think that came across in your paper with this intergenerational care, sort of the references to the new generation and forms of hope.
But also the references to the ancestors, because there is, I mean, I've started a paper which kind of reflecting on the fact that many people are lamenting the notion that they feel they're still suffering for the war's ills, but also because of the prejudices people make about Serbia and what happened in Serbia. So this is a constant kind of move, like, yes, horrible things have happened and we are totally to blame for, and yet, you know, we can't be blamed, as it were, for everything. Now, this group of people, and it's not one group of people, there are people like spread all around, but are having, I think, a different access to those narratives. So they're really thinking about all of these things, and they can be very, very critical. But it's like, let's try to even think about our role in the wars from a different perspective. And that's
So in a way,
they're reaching to the past as well.
I was going to say, it seems that this positionality, particularly with regards to materiality and architecture, well, to me, I think even one of your interlocutors very much looks at architecture, speaks about architecture. But it almost sounded like maybe reading something by Bogdan Bogdanovic or his Gradoslov or something, and there's this particular sort of intellectual tradition orientation which salvaged in some ways, Belgrade, let's say, or cities from their past by saying, well, it didn't originate in the cities. Savagery is one of the words used in and some others by even the savagery originated in the villages, somewhere else. Actually, some anthropologists support this thesis.
Well, even is supremely urban-oriented person, but this is not only about kind of urbanistic view about the future. This was about architecture as a material trace of someone's creativity. So basically what he was trying to say, if you look long enough into the buildings, into the facades of the buildings, you'll recognize the faces of those people who built them. Trying to say two things, I believe. We have to understand the genealogy of so many different aesthetics, but also notions of harmony that, looked on from the status position you have to import to a city if you want to build it in a really interesting way. But it also says, so another person said, even if everyone remained in coma, we would still have the material traces explain to us that not everything has been the way we are seeing or experiencing now. And I think that's really important because, honestly, for the last 20 years, my feeling is that people keep talking only about two things, really the golden 70s and 80s, and then the really, really horrible time that comes afterwards. And even anthropological data about this, it's always and all the time about post-socialist and post-socialist notions. So it's almost as if Serbia starts with Yugoslavia, and there's nothing before, and there are no legacies that link not only Serbia, also Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia. So it's an interesting kind of, from the academic point of view, where do also our colleagues start from when they describe Yugoslavia? So I was trying to react also to that in the beginning when I was saying, maybe we shouldn't be looking at it only from a historical point of view. I think we are, we have to take a break.